She had buried her husband, buried her pride, and buried every dream she ever had for that land. And still, Blackstone Valley wasn't finished with her. The ranch was falling apart nail by nail. Winter was coming in hard, and the men in town had already started dividing up what they assumed would soon be hers no longer. Maren Holloway had nothing left but 3 children who needed her and a stubbornness that refused to lie down. Then a stranger appeared at her door in the dark, half frozen, carrying wounds she couldn't see. And everything she thought she understood about survival, trust, and who this land really belonged to was about to be torn open. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The first hard frost of October came 3 days early that year, and it killed what was left of Maren Holloway's winter squash. She found out at dawn, walking the garden rows in the gray half-light before the children woke, her breath clouding in front of her face. The squash had been her backup plan. Everything on the Holloway ranch operated on backup plans now, the main plan having died somewhere around the same time her husband did, 2.5 years ago, when Dale Holloway's horse threw him on a rocky slope and he didn't get up again. Maren crouched and turned one of the blackened squash in her hands. The skin had gone soft and dark overnight, the flesh ruined. She set it back down carefully, like it deserved some kind of dignity, and then she stood up and stood there for a moment looking at the row. She didn't cry. She'd stopped doing that around 6 months in, when she realized that crying took energy she couldn't spare. She went back to the house and started the stove. By the time the children came down, Nora first, always first, already dressed and moving with the focused competence of an 11-year-old who had grown up faster than she should have. Then Owen, 9, rumpled and dragging his left boot because the lace had broken again. And finally little Cass, who was 6 and still young enough to come downstairs with her hair a genuine disaster and not care. The coffee was boiling, and Maren had already made a mental accounting of what the lost squash meant. It meant she needed to sell 2 more heifers before December. It meant the payment to Aldridge Feed would have to wait another week. It meant she needed to talk to Hattie Morse about whether there was still work available at the dry goods store on weekends. She did not tell the children about the squash. She poured Owen a cup of warm water with a spoon of honey in it because they were low on coffee, and she stretched it thin. "Mama," Nora said, settling at the table with the careful seriousness she brought to everything. "The fence on the east pasture is down again. I saw it yesterday." "I know. The Dalton cattle were getting close to the property line." "I know, Nora." Her daughter looked at her steadily. Nora had Dale's eyes, that flat dark brown that never quite revealed what was happening behind them. On Dale it had been a quality Maren found infuriating and then found herself missing desperately once it was gone. On Nora, it mostly just made Maren feel like she was being evaluated. "I can help you fix it after school," Nora said. "You have arithmetic." "I can do arithmetic after the fence." Maren looked at her daughter, this girl who was already too serious, already too aware of the weight of things. "I'll get the fence," she said. "You do arithmetic." Owen was not listening to any of this. He was feeding pieces of his biscuit to the dog under the table, a maneuver he believed was invisible, and which Maren ignored because picking every battle would kill her. Cass was singing something to herself, not a real song, just the kind of tuneless, wandering noise a 6-year-old makes when she's content. Maren watched her for a moment and felt the specific ache that came with watching Cass. The knowledge that Cass barely remembered Dale, that the father Cass would carry in her mind would be assembled from stories and photographs and the way her siblings talked about him, not from any real lived memory. That particular grief had a texture Maren couldn't describe to anyone. She drank her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the land. Blackstone Valley sat in a fold between 2 long ridgelines about 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, which was Heldren. The valley itself held maybe 60 families, scattered across properties that ranged from modest to genuinely prosperous, and the social architecture of the place was not complicated. The Colton family had the most land and the most money and the most influence, and below them everyone else arranged themselves in a rough hierarchy based on acreage, cattle count, and how long your family had been there. The Holloways had been in the valley since Dale's grandfather, which counted for something in theory. In practice, what counted now was that Dale was dead. The ranch was carrying more debt than it had any business carrying, and Marin was a woman operating without a man in a place where that still meant something it probably shouldn't. She was 34 years old. She'd come to the valley as Dale's wife at 22, a girl from a farming family 2 counties east who had married into the Holloway name with a certain amount of hope and not a full accounting of what the ranch's finances actually looked like. That accounting had come later. Most things had come later. She knew how to ride and how to shoot and how to butcher a hog and how to talk a supplier into extending credit on terms that were technically unreasonable. She knew which of her cattle were too old to winter over and which could make it. She knew that the northeast corner of the property had a slow-moving spring that ran all year even in drought, which was worth more than most people realized, and she knew that the soil in the low meadow was richer than anything else in this part of the valley. What she didn't know, what nobody had ever taught her, because nobody had expected her to need to know it, was how to navigate the legal machinery that had started grinding around her property. That had started 8 months ago, when Garrett Colton came to the ranch for the first time. Garrett Colton was 53, thick through the middle, with the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no in a context that actually cost him anything. He ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, served on the county land board, and had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a generous offer even when it wasn't. He had come to the door on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, with 2 men behind him whom he didn't introduce. "Mrs. Holloway," he'd said, "I won't take much of your time. I just want you to know that I'm aware of your situation, and I want you to know that I'm a man who believes in being neighborly." Marin had stood in the doorway and waited. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the eastern parcel, the low meadow and the creek frontage. You'd keep the house, the upper pasture, enough to operate at a reduced scale. It would clear your outstanding debt to Aldridge and the banknote with something left over." He named a figure. The figure was not fair. It was not close to fair. The eastern parcel and the creek frontage were the 2 most valuable pieces of the property, and the price he named was less than half what she would have gotten if she'd put them on the open market with time to wait for the right buyer. "I appreciate the offer," Marin said. "No." Something shifted in Garrett Colton's face, something small and fast that he put away quickly behind a smooth expression. "Mrs. Holloway, I want to be honest with you. The winters here are not forgiving to operations running as lean as yours currently is. I'm trying to help you avoid a worse outcome." "I appreciate that," she said again. "No." He had nodded, put his hat back on, and left, but that hadn't been the end of it. Since then, there had been 2 more visits from men she didn't know who claimed to represent purchasing interests and who left business cards she threw in the stove. There had been a conversation at the feed store where Aldridge himself, fat, cautious Aldridge, who had always been decent enough, had suggested gently that perhaps she ought to think about what was realistic going forward. There had been a Sunday after services where 3 ranch wives had talked around her in that particular way women use when they want you to know they're discussing you without the awkwardness of saying so directly. The valley was circling. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming. The fence on the east pasture was not down, exactly. 3 rails had split, old wood that had needed replacing for 2 years, and they'd finally given way in some overnight wind. Marin spent 2 hours that morning cutting new rails from timber she'd been holding back, her breath steaming, her hands getting raw through the gloves. She was 45 minutes into it when she heard hooves and looked up to see Tom Dalton riding along the property line from the north. He pulled up his horse at a polite distance and sat watching her. Tom was a few years older than she was, a widower himself, a decent enough man who ran a modest operation to the north. He had a way of being kind that sometimes came out sideways, like kindness that wasn't quite sure of itself. "Morning, Marin." "Tom." "Fence gave out?" "I can see that, yes, thank you." He sat there for a moment. His horse shifted and he brought it back easy. "Listen," he said, "I heard from Curtis Mills that the Colton people have been talking to people at the county seat about the Holloway property lines." Marin kept working. "That a fact?" "Something about a surveying dispute, old boundary records." He paused. "I don't know the details. I just thought you ought to hear it. She drove a nail, hard. The rail seated solid. I've got the original survey documents. Dale kept them in the deed box." "I know. I'm just saying." He cleared his throat. "If you needed someone to look them over, Someone who understood how those disputes work. I'll manage, Tom. There was a pause. You always say that? Because it's always true. He nodded slowly, tipped his hat, and rode back north. She watched him go, and then she stood there holding the hammer, and she thought about the survey documents in the deed box and whether she actually understood them and whether she should go through them tonight after the children were in bed. She thought about the banknote due in February, which she could meet if the heifer sales went well and if the winter wasn't too brutal and if nothing broke, that cost real money to fix. She thought about the squash she'd found this morning, soft and ruined in the frost. She picked up the next rail and kept working. The stranger arrived that night. It was nearly 9 o'clock. The children long since in bed. The fire burned down low. Marin was at the kitchen table with the deed box open in front of her, papers spread out, reading the survey documents by lamplight and understanding about half of what they said. The property descriptions were written in the kind of formal language that seemed designed to prevent ordinary people from knowing what they owned. She heard the sound outside before she heard the knock. The scrape of boots on the porch boards, uneven, like someone favoring one side. Then the knock came, and it was the knock of someone who didn't have much force left in the hand that made it. She kept still for a moment, which was what you did. Then she reached to the wall for the shotgun Dale had hung there 8 years ago, and which she had loaded 6 months back when the unwanted visitors started coming around. She carried it to the door and spoke through the wood. "Who's there?" A pause. Then, "Name's Mercer. I'm not looking for trouble. I need..." A cough. "I need to get out of the cold for a while, ma'am." The voice was rough and low and came with the sound of someone having a hard time with his breathing. "Are you armed?" "Pistol on my right hip. I'll put it down wherever you tell me." She thought about it. She was aware that this was either a sick man in the cold or the setup for something, and she didn't have enough information to know which. She also knew that the temperature outside had dropped to where a man wouldn't survive the night without shelter if he was already in a bad way. "Step back off the porch," she said. "Step to the right where I can see you from the window." She heard him move. She went to the kitchen window and looked out. He was standing in the yard in the thin moonlight that came off the snow. A tall man, or he'd been tall before he started holding himself like that. One arm braced against his ribs on the left side. His coat was inadequate for the weather, a riding coat, not a winter coat. He had his right hand away from his hip, and he was standing facing the window so she could see him, and even from the distance in the bad light she could see that he was in genuine difficulty. She was not a foolish woman. She knew that a man's appearance of distress didn't make him trustworthy. She was also not a hard-hearted woman, though she'd been working on becoming one. "The pistol!" she called through the glass. He reached across with his left hand. She noticed it was his left, not his gun hand, and pulled the pistol from the holster and set it down on the porch railing. She opened the door. He was worse up close than he'd looked from the window. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, with the particular hollowed quality of someone who hadn't been eating properly or sleeping enough for a while. There was a gash on the left side of his face, 5 or 6 days old by the look of it, not well tended. He was holding his left side in a way that suggested at least one cracked rib, maybe more. His hands were the interesting part. They were the hands of a man who did hard physical work, rough and scarred, but the scarring was old, and the roughness underneath that was something different, the roughness that came from a different kind of life. "Inside," she said, stepping back and keeping the shotgun ready but lowered. He came in. She shut the door and latched it and watched him take in the kitchen. The papers on the table, the deed box, the low fire, the 3 children's coats on the hooks by the stairs. He looked at all of it with the careful attention of someone who noticed things and filed them away. "Sit down," she said. "There." He sat at the kitchen table in the chair she indicated. When he sat, the held breath quality he'd been carrying came loose a little, which told her that standing upright had cost him more than he was showing. She set the shotgun on the counter within reach and got the kettle. "What happened to you?" "Came off my horse in the dark. Ice on the trail east of here." "How far east?" Mile and a half. That's rough country. Where were you riding to?" A pause. "I was headed here, actually, to the valley. I didn't have a specific..." He stopped. "I was looking for somewhere to work through the winter." She put the kettle on and turned to look at him. "Looking for work?" "Yes, ma'am." "Where are you coming from?" "Wyoming, mostly. Before that, further." He met her eyes and then looked away. There was something in his face that she filed away the same way he'd filed away her kitchen, a quality of something being held back, not as a lie exactly, more as information he didn't think she needed yet. "The wound on your face is infected," she said. "I know. I've got carbolic and clean cloth. You'll let me tend it." It wasn't entirely a question. He looked at her again, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." "His name?" he told her as she cleaned and dressed the cut. He sat still for it, still in a way that seemed practiced, a way that made her think he'd had wounds tended before and knew how to hold himself through it. Was Rhett Mercer. He was from Colorado originally. He'd been working cattle since he was 15 years old, had done some freighting, some other things he listed briefly without elaborating. "You have any references?" she said. "Men I worked for in Wyoming. I can write down names. Can they be reached?" "One can. The other died in the summer." She wrapped the last of the bandage and stepped back. "The ribs? Bruised, I think, not broken. I've had broken ribs. These don't feel the same. You'd know the difference." "I'd know the difference." She poured the coffee. Real coffee, the last of what she had, because something about the situation called for it, and set it in front of him and sat down across the table with her hands around her own cup. "I have 3 children," she said. "I operate this ranch alone. I can't pay wages, not real wages. I can offer room and board through the winter and a fair share when we sell cattle in the spring. If we sell in the spring, which isn't certain." She paused. "The work is hard and some of it is dangerous, and I'll need you to follow my direction on how things are done here because I know this land and you don't." He looked at her steadily. She had the feeling he was doing the same assessment she was doing, reading her the way she was reading him, and that he was noting the same things she was noting, that neither of them had a great deal of options in this moment. "That's a fair offer," he said. "It's the only offer." "Yes, ma'am. I understand that. And my children." She held his eyes. "Whatever else, my children are not to be worried. Not with problems of the ranch, not with threats we might be dealing with. They're children. If you can't agree to that, you take your pistol off my porch railing and you find somewhere else." Something shifted in his expression, something that was almost pain and was there and gone fast. "I understand," he said. "I'll show you the barn," she said. "There's a room in the back that'll do. I'll bring you more blankets." She showed him out to the barn with a lantern, gave him the room, brought 3 blankets and an extra pillow from the house chest. On her way back, she stopped and picked up the pistol from the porch railing and brought it inside with her. She set it on the kitchen table next to the deed box and looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the survey documents and read them until her eyes gave out. Quote, "In the morning, Nora was the one who saw him first. She'd gone to the barn before breakfast, as she did every morning, to check on the horses and the milk cow, and she came back in with a look on her face that was a specific combination of careful and watchful that Marin recognized. 'There's a man in the back room,' Nora said. 'I know. He arrived last night. His name is Mr. Mercer. He had an accident on the trail.' Nora looked at her. 'Is he working here now?' 'For the winter, maybe longer.' 'Did you ask him?' 'I was careful,' Marin said. 'Go wake your brother.' Owen, when he learned about the stranger, reacted with the uncomplicated excitement of a 9-year-old boy who had been living in a house with no men and who had not yet learned to be careful about what he was excited about. He was in the barn before breakfast was done, and Marin could hear him through the wall. The fast, running commentary of a boy talking at someone who was doing something, the kind of talk that required very little response from the other party. She sent Nora to bring Owen back and told Cass to stay in the kitchen. Cass stayed in the kitchen for about 4 minutes and then appeared in the barn doorway, her coat on but unbuttoned, her hair still not done. She stopped in the doorway and looked at Rhett with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a 6-year-old. "You got a hurt face," she said. Rhett was sitting on a crate, eating the breakfast Marin had sent out, biscuits, a hard-boiled egg, coffee, and he looked up at Cass without flinching. "I do," he said. "Does it hurt?" "A little." "My brother Owen got his face cut once on some wire," Cass said, moving into the barn with the confidence of someone who owned it. "He cried." "I probably did too," Rhett said. Cass considered this information. "Mama said you fell off your horse." "That's right." Mama says only bad horsemen fall off horses. Cass, Marin said from behind her. Cass turned. He said he fell off his horse. Inside. Go finish your breakfast. Cass went, but she cast one more look over her shoulder at Rhett on her way out, as though she was still collecting data. Marin stood in the barn doorway and met Rhett's eyes briefly. He had the look of a man who was not sure whether he was allowed to find any of this funny. She's not wrong, he said, about bad horsemen. The ice was bad. Yes, ma'am. It was. She left him to his breakfast. What she hadn't told the children, what she hadn't told anyone, was how close things actually were. The banknote on the ranch, the primary note, the one Dale had taken out 8 years ago to buy the eastern parcel and improve the water infrastructure, was due in February. The note was held by Heldren Savings, and the president of Heldren Savings was a man named Whitfield, who served on the county land board alongside Garrett Colton, which was not a coincidence that Marin had ever been fully able to assess. She had the money to meet the payment, barely, if the heifer sales went through and if nothing catastrophic happened before February. She had it in a way that would leave her with nothing in reserve, no margin, no cushion for a broken axle or a sick horse or a bad run of weather. Last February, the payment had been late by 2 weeks. Whitfield had sent her a letter about it that was technically polite and actually threatening. She had made the payment and nothing had come of it, but the letter sat in the deed box now, like a warning. The survey dispute Tom Dalton had mentioned, she'd found something in the documents last night that she didn't understand, a discrepancy between the original survey and what appeared to be a later amendment that she didn't have the full text of. She didn't know what it meant or whether it meant anything, but it sat in her mind the way the letter from Whitfield sat in the deed box. She needed the ranch to make it to spring. That was all. Spring and the cattle sales, and she could breathe. But between now and spring was winter, and winter in Blackstone Valley didn't care what you needed. Rhett Mercer worked through the first day on the fence line. She'd shown him the broken rails and given him the materials and come back 4 hours later to find 3 sections repaired with a steadiness and solidity that told her he'd done this before and knew what he was doing. He'd also restaked 2 fence posts that had gone soft in the ground without being asked to. She walked the fence and didn't say anything for a moment. The 2 posts, she said, they'd have given out by January. I know, she paused. Good work. He nodded. He was sweating despite the cold, which meant he'd been pushing himself. The bruised ribs were slowing him down. She could see it in how he moved, but he wasn't stopping for them. She should have told him to take it easier on account of the ribs. She didn't, because she couldn't afford for him to take it easier. That made her feel something she didn't have a word for, a kind of guilt that was also a kind of necessity, and she didn't like either quality of it. At dinner, she introduced him to the children properly, all 3 at the table, which hadn't been the full arrangement in a while because Owen often ate at odd times when he'd been out with her working. She watched Rhett navigate the introduction carefully, shaking hands with Owen, who offered his hand with enormous seriousness, and with Nora, who was assessing him with those dark eyes, and crouching down briefly for Cass, who was already half sold on him based on the earlier barn encounter. Mr. Mercer's going to be helping with the ranch work through the winter, Marin said. Are you good at fixing things? Owen asked. I try to be. Can you fix my fishing rod? The tip broke. Owen, Marin said. It's a reasonable question, Rhett said, without looking at Marin. And yes, I think I probably can. Owen looked satisfied. Nora looked skeptical. Cass was putting butter on her biscuit with extreme concentration. Marin watched all 4 of them, this temporary arrangement around her table, this stranger in her home, and felt several things simultaneously that she didn't have time to sort through. She ate her dinner and talked about what the next 2 days of work were and didn't look at Rhett Mercer more than was necessary to figure out if she'd made a mistake letting him in. She wasn't sure yet. She wouldn't be sure for a while. That was the truth of it. What she didn't know that night, what she wouldn't know for weeks, was that Rhett Mercer had sat in the back room of her barn for an hour before he fell asleep, looking at the walls of a structure he recognized, a structure he'd been in before, in another life that had ended so badly that returning to it had seemed impossible for years. He had ridden back to this valley because there was a piece of unfinished business that he had been avoiding for 5 years. He had not expected to find a woman fighting for her life on the land connected to that business. He had not expected 3 children or a kitchen full of deed documents or a conversation that made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like a person who might be capable of being useful to someone. He had not told her the truth, not the full truth. He told himself he would, when the timing was right, when things were more settled, when he had a better read on the situation. He told himself that, in the dark, in the barn, listening to the wind work at the eaves. Outside, the temperature dropped further, and the valley filled up with cold silence, and the stars above Blackstone Valley were very bright and very far away, the way stars always are when there's no warmth left in the air below them. In the house, Maren Holloway put the deed documents back in the box, latched it shut, blew out the lamp, and went to bed. She lay there in the dark for a while, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about the fence rails and the February payment and the survey discrepancy and the man sleeping in her barn. She thought about whether she'd made a mistake. She thought about what it had felt like to walk that fence line and find the work done right. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her, because in the morning there would be more work, and the morning always came whether she was ready for it or not. 3 days after Rhett Mercer arrived, Owen's fishing rod was fixed. It was a small thing, a split piece of tipwood wrapped tight with thread and sealed with pine resin that Rhett had found in a tin on the workbench. And it wasn't pretty. The wrap was thick and utilitarian, and the color was off, but it held. Owen tested it by the barn door, flexing the rod gently, the way Maren had seen Dale do 100 times, checking the give of it. And when it held, he looked up at Rhett with the uncomplicated gratitude of a 9-year-old boy who had been waiting months for someone to have time for something that small. Maren watched from the kitchen window and made herself turn away. She was not going to read things into it. She was practical enough to know that a man who fixed a fishing rod might also steal from the house, or drink himself insensible, or disappear on her in February when she needed him most. Kindness toward children was not a character reference. She knew that. She turned away from the window and went back to the ledger. But the week continued, and the week was difficult to argue with. Rhett worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent a long time operating alone, without supervision, and who didn't need to be told twice what needed doing. He assessed problems before he came to her. She'd find him standing at the corner of the chicken coop or walking the pasture line with that look on his face. The one she was starting to recognize, the working something out look. And when he came to her, it was with a proposed solution, not just the problem. The water trough in the north pasture had a slow leak they'd been managing with constant refilling since August. Rhett found it on the 4th day, traced it to a hairline crack on the western wall that had been patched badly at some point, and reseeded the whole section with new mortar he mixed himself. It took him a full day and a half. The trough held after that. "How'd you know how to do that?" Owen asked him the afternoon it was done. "Watched someone do it once," Rhett said. "Watched a lot of things." "Did you fix a lot of ranches?" "Some." "Were any of them as big as ours?" Rhett paused for just a beat. "Some were bigger," he said. "None were better positioned." Owen didn't fully understand what that meant. Maren, passing with a bucket, understood it and kept walking. Oshkes. The town's opinion of the arrangement arrived on a Thursday in the form of Agnes Whitmore. Agnes was 61 years old, had lived in Blackstone Valley for 40 of those years, and operated under the conviction that she had both the right and the responsibility to know what was happening on every property within 5 miles of her own. She arrived in a buckboard with her younger daughter Clara, who was 23 and had her mother's eyes and none of her mother's confidence about using them. Maren saw the buckboard coming up the track and went to meet them in the yard. "Agnes," she said. "Maren." Agnes climbed down from the buckboard with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been climbing in and out of buckboards for 4 decades. She looked at the yard, the repaired fence rails visible from where they stood, the cleaned-out drainage ditch along the track. She looked at all of this with an expression that was working hard to be neutral. "I heard you had taken on a hired man." "News travels." "It always does." Agnes smoothed her skirt. "Who is he?" "A man looking for winter work. His name is Mercer." "Where's he from?" "Wyoming, mostly." Maren kept her voice easy. "He came in off the trail last week with a cracked rib and a cut on his face that needed tending. He knows cattle work, and he's strong, and he's respectful to the children." Agnes made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Clara stood behind her mother and gave Maren a look that was pure sympathy, which Maren appreciated and couldn't use. "People are talking, Maren." "People were talking before he got here." "This is different," Agnes said, and now her voice had dropped, had taken on the quality it got when she believed she was genuinely trying to help. A strange man living on the property. You're a widow. People will say, Agnes, Marin said, what people say hasn't kept my cattle fed or my fence line standing. I appreciate that you came, truly, but I need help, and he can work, and that's the whole of it. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked past Marin toward the barn, where Rhett was visible in the doorway, paused in whatever he was doing, watching the exchange with the careful stillness of someone who understood what was happening without needing to hear the words. He looks capable enough, Agnes said, in a tone that gave nothing away. He is. Another pause. Agnes reached back into the buckboard and produced a covered dish. Cornbread, she said. Clara made it. Marin took it. Thank you. Agnes nodded crisply, climbed back up into the buckboard, and left. Clara looked back once from the seat, and the look was more complicated than sympathy. It was the look of a woman who understood that Marin was making a choice that required a certain kind of nerve, and who wasn't sure if she admired it or feared for her. Marin stood in the yard with the cornbread and watched the buckboard go. The conversation with Garrett Colton came 11 days in, and it didn't happen at the ranch. She'd gone to Heldren for supplies, flour, salt, lamp oil, nails, and she was loading the wagon outside the hardware store when she heard his voice behind her. Mrs. Holloway, she kept loading. Mr. Colton. He came to stand near the wagon, but not too near, which was the kind of spatial calculation she had come to expect from him. Everything he did was calculated. I heard you've taken on a hand, he said. News travels. Where's he from? Wyoming. You know his people? She turned and looked at him directly. I know his work. That's enough. Colton nodded slowly, not agreeing with her, just acknowledging that she'd spoken. He had his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets and his hat tilted against the thin winter sun. I want to be straight with you, he said, which in Marin's experience was something men said when they were about to be the opposite. The survey question isn't going away. The county board has received a petition regarding the boundary on the eastern edge of your property, and there will need to be a hearing. She kept her expression steady. What petition? A formal request for survey review, filed by an interested party. What interested party? He met her eyes and didn't answer, which was itself an answer. If there's a legal question about my property lines, Marin said carefully, then I'll address it through legal means. I have the original survey documents, and I know what they say. Original documents can be complicated to interpret, Colton said. Amendments, corrections, subsequent filings, these things get tangled. A good attorney could help you navigate that. I'm sure one could. If cost is a consideration, Mr. Colton, she said, and her voice was steady and cold, if you're offering to help me find legal representation out of neighborly concern, I'll tell you what I told you the last 3 times you took an interest in my property. I appreciate the thought. I don't need the help. Something hardened in his face, brief and real, before the smooth expression came back. Stubborn woman, he said, and she wasn't entirely sure he meant for her to hear it. Yes, she said. That's correct. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Good day, Mr. Colton. She drove out of Heldren without stopping, and she held herself together all the way back up the valley road. And she was 3 miles from home when she pulled the horses up for a moment and sat there in the cold and let her hands shake. A survey hearing, a petition from an unnamed interested party. She didn't have an attorney, and she couldn't afford an attorney, and she didn't fully understand the survey documents she had, and Garrett Colton knew all 3 of those things. She sat with her hands shaking for maybe 2 minutes. Then she made herself stop, made herself breathe, made herself pick up the reins. She went home. She told Red about it that evening. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to go through the documents again herself, make notes, figure out what she was dealing with before she said anything to anyone. But after dinner, when the children were upstairs and the kitchen was quiet, she found herself at the table with the deed box open again, and when Rhett came in from checking the horses and saw her face, he stopped in the doorway. Something happened in town, he said. Not a question. She looked up at him. There's going to be a survey hearing, she said. County board. Someone filed a petition about the eastern boundary. He came in and sat down across from her, slowly, with the careful way he moved when his ribs were bothering him. He looked at the document spread between them. You have the original survey. Yes. And something I don't understand, there's a reference here to an amendment filed in 1887. I don't have the amendment. I don't know what it says. He looked at the document she was pointing to. He was quiet for a moment, reading. She watched his face and saw something there. Not surprise exactly, more like a careful settling, the way someone looks when they receive information they were partly expecting. "You'd need to get the amendment from the county records office," he said. "I know. I need to go back to Heldren. Or send someone." "I don't have anyone to send." He looked at her. "You have me." She considered him across the table. "I'd need to know you'd come back with the right document. I'd need to know you understood what you were looking for." "I can read a land survey," he said. "I've read enough of them." She didn't ask why. There were things about him she was still not asking, because she'd decided, practically, that what she needed right now was a man who could work and who didn't cause trouble. And asking too many questions might complicate that arrangement before she could afford to have it complicated. Later, she would understand this choice differently. In this moment, she filed it away. "All right," she said. "I'll write down what I need." Nora came to Marin's room late that night, which she almost never did. She knocked first. That was the thing about Nora. She was 11 going on 35. She knocked. And when Marin told her to come in, she pushed the door open and stood there in her nightgown with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, looking younger than she did in daylight. "I can't sleep," she said. "Come here." Nora climbed onto the bed and sat cross-legged the way she used to when she was Cass's age, before she'd decided that was babyish. Marin sat up against the headboard and waited. "Is Mr. Mercer going to stay?" Nora asked. "Through the winter, that's the arrangement. What if he decides to leave early?" "Then he leaves early, and we manage." Nora picked at a thread on the quilt, Dale's mother's quilt pieced from old shirts, softer than anything else in the house from years of washing. "Owen likes him a lot," she said. "I know. That worries me." Marin looked at her daughter. "Why?" "Because Owen doesn't—" Nora stopped, started again. "Owen remembers Papa less than I do, and he just attached himself, like he's been waiting to." She paused. "I don't think Mr. Mercer is bad. I think he's probably fine. I just don't want Owen to get used to him." Marin didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about what it cost her daughter to say that. 11 years old, carrying the awareness that attachments were dangerous because things left, because men died or rode away, because you couldn't afford to need something you weren't certain of keeping. "I know," she said finally. "I'm watching. That's not the same as it being okay." "No," Marin agreed. "It's not." Nora sat there for a little longer and then unfolded herself and went back to her room, and Marin lay in the dark thinking about her daughter's face and about the survey documents and about the man in the barn who had said he could read a land survey. The trouble with the Dalton cattle happened on a Tuesday. Rhett was working the water line in the upper pasture when he heard them. The particular sound of cattle that weren't where they were supposed to be, moving through a gap in the fence she hadn't known was there yet. There were 6 head, Dalton's mark, already deep into the north corner of her winter grazing. He found the gap, pulled wire from the supply cache she'd shown him, and was half done closing it when Tom Dalton came riding up from his side of the line. The 2 men looked at each other across the fence. "Those your cattle?" Rhett said. Tom assessed him in the way men in the valley were doing with Rhett, carefully, a little sideways, trying to take a measure. "They are. I'll get them back." "I'd appreciate that." Tom didn't move immediately. "You're the man Marin took on." "Rhett Mercer." A pause. "How's she doing?" "Honestly." Rhett kept working the wire. "She's capable." "I know she's capable. That's not what I asked." Rhett looked up at him. "She's holding," he said. "She could use a winter that doesn't throw anything new at her." Tom nodded. He looked off down the fence line. "Garrett Colton's been talking to 2 men from a land company out of Denver. Not in public. Quiet. I heard it from someone reliable." He brought his eyes back to Rhett. "If that hearing goes wrong for her, they'll move fast. There won't be time to respond." "What are you telling me for?" "Because you're the one who's there," Tom said simply. He turned his horse and went to collect his cattle. Rhett watched him go, then went back to the wire, his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was making a decision he didn't entirely like. He finished the fence and went back to the ranch and didn't say anything about the conversation with Tom Dalton, not that night. He stood outside for a while after dinner, in the cold, looking at the valley and thinking about what he knew that Marin didn't know yet, and about how long he could keep those two things separate. Not long, he thought. It was already getting difficult. The afternoon Cass got hurt was an ordinary afternoon that turned bad fast. She'd been following Owen to the woodpile, which she was not supposed to do, and she'd climbed up onto the splitting stump the way she was definitely not supposed to do, and she'd fallen off and caught her arm on the iron wedge that Owen had left handle up in the woodblock. The cut was not serious. It bled significantly as face and arm cuts do, in a way that was disproportionate to the actual severity, and it needed cleaning and pressure and someone to hold Cass while she cried. Marin was in the root cellar and heard the noise and came running, but Rhett was closer. He'd been splitting the next day's wood 10 feet away, and he was already kneeling in the dirt with Cass when Marin got there, his bandana folded and pressed firm against her arm, his voice steady and quiet, talking her through the noise of it. "I know," he was saying. "I know it hurts. Keep it pressed. It's going to be all right." Cass had both hands over his hand, holding the bandana, and she was crying, but she wasn't panicking the way she sometimes did. That high, bright spiral that meant they'd lost her to it. She was upset, and she was with it, following his voice. Marin knelt down and took over, and Rhett stepped back and led her, which was the right thing to do, and she noticed that he did it without being told. Later, after the arm was cleaned and wrapped and Cass was on the kitchen settle with Owen reading to her from the animal pictures book, Marin found Rhett washing the blood off his hands at the yard pump. "Thank you," she said. "She's fine," he said, mostly scared. "I know." A pause. "You were good with her." He looked at his hands. Something was in his face, the thing she still didn't have a name for. "She's easy to be good with," he said. She left it there. She went back inside. But she stood at the kitchen window again, briefly, and looked at him still standing at the pump, and she thought about Tom Dalton saying he was there, and that being the whole of the reason. She thought about Nora's careful, frightened practicality. She thought about Owen and the fishing rod. She thought about how a thing could become necessary before you'd made any kind of decision about it. She turned from the window and went to check on Cass. Outside, the cold came down again with the dark, and somewhere south of the valley, the Colton operation kept doing whatever it was doing in the quiet that precedes a larger move, and Rhett Mercer stood at the pump long after his hands were clean, looking north toward a ridge he recognized from a different time, a different life, carrying the weight of something that was going to have to be said, and knowing the saying of it was going to change everything. The days kept moving. Winter pressed in, and the thing between the woman in the house and the man in the barn grew in the way that real things do. Not smoothly, not neatly, but accumulating, the way snow accumulates, one cold, ordinary day at a time, until you look up and the weight of it is something you have to reckon with. Rhett came back from Heldren on a Friday afternoon with the amendment document, and Marin knew something was wrong before he handed it to her. It wasn't anything dramatic. He just had a stillness about him when he rode in, a quality of having made a decision about something and not yet having said it. And she had been watching him long enough now, 6 weeks was long enough, to know the difference between his ordinary quiet and this. She was at the kitchen table with the children doing their evening work, Nora on her arithmetic, Owen copying letters with the sullen efficiency of a boy who found handwriting personally offensive, Cass drawing horses in the margin of her primer. Rhett came in, set the document on the table in front of her without speaking, and stood back. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "The children need to finish their lessons," he said, carefully. Something about the way he said it made Nora look up, made Marin's chest go tight. "Finish your pages," Marin told them. "All 3 of you, then upstairs." It took 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes she could remember. She sat at the table with the document face down in front of her and drank the last of the cold coffee and didn't look at Rhett, who stood near the stove with his arms crossed and didn't look at her either. When the children were up the stairs and she heard the creak of their footsteps overhead, she turned the document over. She read it once, quickly, the way you read something when you're hoping you've misunderstood. Then she read it again slowly. The amendment was dated September 1889. It was a transfer of title, a legal correction to the original survey filing, clarifying the ownership record following the death of one James Mercer, in which the full property title to the Holloway Ranch, all parcels, was to be held in the name of his surviving son, Rhett Aaron Mercer. She read the name twice. Then she put the document down flat on the table with both hands, very carefully, the way you put down something you're afraid of dropping. The kitchen was very quiet. "Tell me," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she could see that he'd been rehearsing some version of this, and that none of the versions had felt right, and that what came out now was not rehearsed at all. "My father built this ranch," he said. "James Mercer. He came to the valley in 1873, staked the land, built the house, put in the water. This was his place." He paused. "When I was 19, my mother died. My father and we didn't do well together after that. We said things that didn't get unsaid. I left." Marin sat very still. "I was gone for years. I didn't come back. There were letters, a few, nothing good in them. Then in 1889, I got word that he was sick." He looked at his hands. "I came back too late. He was already gone. The ranch had debts I didn't know about, and there were men circling it the same way they're circling yours now, and I wasn't in a position to hold it. I thought I was doing the right thing." His voice was level and steady, and she could hear underneath it the specific flatness of someone who had told himself a thing so many times that the telling had worn smooth. "I sold the debt to a man named Aldridge. I signed over the management rights to cover what was owed. I left enough arrangement in place to keep the property operating. I thought someone would buy it clean. I thought it would be settled. But it wasn't settled," Marin said. "The man I sold the debt to sold it again. The management arrangement turned into a lease. The lease turned into... I don't know exactly how it went from there. I was in Wyoming by then. I lost track." He finally looked at her directly. "The legal title was never fully transferred. The amendment corrected it in the records, but it was never completed with a formal deed transfer, which means on paper, under county records, you own this land," she said. The words came out flat and clear. "On paper," he said. "Yes." Marin stood up. She walked to the kitchen window and stood there looking out at the dark. At the yard she could barely see, the fence line, the barn. She stood there long enough that the silence became its own kind of pressure. "How long have you known?" she said, without turning around. "I suspected from the first night, when I saw the deed box. When you told me the name of the property." A pause. "I was certain after I went to Heldren. That was 3 weeks ago." "Yes." She turned around. "3 weeks," she said, and her voice was not raised, which was almost worse than if it had been. "You have known for 3 weeks that you own this land. You have sat at my table. You have eaten my food. You have let my son..." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "You let my son follow you around like you were someone he could trust." "Marin..." "Don't." The word came out hard. "Don't say my name right now." He closed his mouth. She stood there in the kitchen with the document between them on the table, and she felt the specific grief of someone who has had a thing taken from them that they were barely holding in the first place. And she felt the anger that comes with having been careful, having been appropriately suspicious, and still having been wrong. "Everything I did to this place," she said. "Every fence rail, every payment, every night I sat here trying to figure out how to make it to the next month." Her voice cracked slightly, and she hated it, hated the crack in it. "Dale is buried in the East Field. My children grew up on this land, and you..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," he said. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to sit there and say you know." He didn't say anything else. "Get out," she said. "Take your things from the barn and go." He stood up slowly. He looked at her, and what was in his face was not the smooth manufactured regret she might have expected. It was something uglier and more honest than that, the look of a man paying for something he actually owed. He picked up his hat from the hook. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. "Whatever happens with the property," he said, "I won't let them take it from you. That's not why I came back." "Then why did you come back?" A long pause. "I don't know," he said. "I told myself I came to sell it and be done with it. I don't know if that was ever true." He went out. She heard his footsteps cross the porch, descend the steps, move across the yard toward the barn. She sat back down at the table and put her face in her hands and held herself together by main force. Upstairs, she heard Cass's voice asking Nora something, the murmur of Nora's response. She heard Owen's footsteps, restless, back and forth the way he moved when he couldn't settle. She sat there for a long time. He was still in the barn in the morning. She saw the light under the door when she went out at dawn, and she stopped in the yard and stood there in the cold and thought about it. She could go in and tell him again to leave. She could walk past and go about her work and ignore the light. She could go back inside and decide later. She went past and did the morning feeding, and when she came back by the barn door, she stopped again, and this time she pushed it open. He was sitting on this crate where she'd first found him with the children, and he had the pistol disassembled on the workbench in front of him, cleaning it, not because it needed cleaning particularly, but because it was something to do with his hands. He looked up when she came in. "Nora knows something's wrong," Marin said. "She's going to ask me, and I'm going to have to answer her." He said nothing. "What I told you last night stands, but I need to know. Is there anyone else who knows about the title? Anyone who could use it against me before I can get my own attorney and figure out what the legal situation actually is?" He was quiet for a moment. "Colton doesn't know. Not specifically. He knows there's a question about the eastern boundary because he's the one who filed the petition, but the title issue is separate from the survey dispute. They're connected, but not the same. Would he find out? He might. If someone at the county records office talks, the amendment document isn't hidden." He paused. "If Colton finds out that the title was never properly transferred, he won't need the survey dispute anymore. He can go directly to the title question and use it to force a sale." Marin leaned against the barn wall and looked at the ceiling. "How long do I have?" "I don't know, weeks maybe, possibly less." "What would you do?" she said. The question surprised her, coming out of her own mouth. "If I weren't here, if it were just you and the property, what would you actually do?" He turned the pistol barrel in his hands. "I came back intending to sell. Find a clean buyer, settle the legal questions, take whatever money was left and go." He paused. "I don't want to do that anymore." "Because of what you found here?" "Yes." "Don't," she said, and her voice was tired now more than angry. "Don't make this. I can't think about that right now. I need to think about my children and my land and what I'm going to do when this comes apart." "I know." "If you know," she said, "then figure out how to help me fix it. That's what you can do. Not whatever else you think this is. Fix it." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. She left the barn. The thing came apart 11 days later, faster than she'd anticipated, which was how these things always went. It was a Wednesday just after noon when she saw the two riders coming up the track. She didn't recognize them from a distance, but she recognized the type. Men who wore their suits on horseback, men who brought papers. She met them in the yard. The taller one had a leather satchel and a name she immediately forgot, and he represented a Denver land company whose name she had heard once from Tom Dalton in a different context. He had a manner that was professionally regretful, the practiced sympathy of a man who delivered bad news frequently and had stopped being troubled by it. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to inform you that a legal challenge has been filed against the operating claim on this property, citing an unresolved title discrepancy." He produced a document. "You'll have 30 days to respond through the county court, but in the meantime, I'm authorized to present an offer of purchase on behalf of my clients." "I'm not selling," Marin said. "The offer is substantial," he said. "Given the legal uncertainty, I'm not selling." The second man, shorter, less polished, the kind of man who stood behind the first man in case the first man's professional sympathy failed, was looking past her toward the house, looking at the kitchen window where Cass's face had appeared, small and confused. "You have children," the taller man said, his tone shifting just slightly, taking on something that was not quite a threat, but was pointed in that direction. "The legal process, if it runs its course, can be protracted and difficult. And if the court finds in favor of the title claimant, Marin said. "The legal owner of record," he said, carefully. "Is standing behind you," said Rhett. Both men turned. Rhett had come from the barn without her hearing him, which meant he'd been watching from the door and had come across the yard quietly, and he was standing now at the edge of the conversation with his arms loose at his sides, and his face carrying the particular expression that Marin had come to understand meant that he had made a decision and was past the point of reconsidering it. The taller man reassembled himself quickly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, and the fact that he knew the name told Marin everything about where this was coming from and how organized it was. "We've been trying to reach you. Our clients have a very fair offer. I know what your clients have, Rhett said. I know who your clients are. I know Garrett Colton put them up to this, and I know the timeline you're working on. He looked at Marin for a brief moment, something passing between them that she couldn't fully name, and then back at the men. I'm not selling. Not to your clients, not to anyone. And the title question is going to be resolved legally through proper transfer. There won't be anything for your clients to purchase. The shorter man spoke for the first time. Mr. Mercer, if you're claiming this property, the current occupant has no legal... The current occupant, Rhett said, is keeping this land alive. She's been doing it for 2.5 years with no help from anyone, against people who have been trying to starve her out since her husband died. His voice had not risen. It was flat and quiet and completely certain. I'm not going to be the instrument of that. So you can tell your clients that the offer is rejected and the property isn't available. And if they want to bring this to the county court, they're welcome to spend the money doing it. The taller man looked at him for a moment. You understand that a refusal to cooperate with the legal process. I understand exactly what I'm doing, Rhett said. Do you need me to say it again, or are we finished here? A long pause. The two men exchanged a look, the look of men recalculating. Then the taller one put the document back in his satchel, and they got on their horses and rode down the track. Marin stood in the yard and watched them go. When the sound of the hooves faded, she turned to Rhett and looked at him for a moment without speaking. There was a great deal she could have said. There was anger still in her, layered under everything else, unresolved, the kind of anger that doesn't disappear because someone does something right. It just waits. You should have told me, she said, weeks ago, before any of this. Yes, he said. I should have. I don't know if I can... She stopped. Started again. I don't know what this is between us now. I don't know if what you just did makes it better, or if I'm still... She pressed her lips together. I need to think. I know. What happens now, legally? I need to go to the city, the county seat, possibly Denver. There are documents that need to be filed to properly transfer the title, clear the ownership record, and establish your claim legally so it can't be challenged the way they're trying to challenge it now. He paused. It'll take money I mostly don't have, and time I'll need to spend away from here. Marin looked at the track where the men had ridden away. Then she looked at the house, at the window where Cass's face had been, where now there were two faces, Cass and Owen both, watching. When? She said. Soon, before Colton finds another angle. He looked at her. While I'm gone, don't sign anything. Don't let anyone on the property who comes with papers. If Tom Dalton comes, you can trust him. No one else. She nodded. He moved to go back to the barn, and she said, without planning to, Why did you really come back? Not the version you told yourself, the real one. He stopped walking. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Because I left something wrong, he said finally. I left my father's land in a bad way, and I left the memory of him in a worse way, and I'd been carrying both of those things for 5 years. I thought if I came back and settled the property, I could put it down. He turned, partially, not quite looking at her. And then I got here and found someone fighting for it, the way I never did. And I didn't know what to do with that. She stood in the cold yard and absorbed that. Go get the documents, she said. Come back. He turned the rest of the way and looked at her. The afternoon light was flat and pale on the yard between them. Yes, ma'am, he said. He left on Thursday morning before the children were up. Marin was in the kitchen when he knocked, brought his saddlebag in briefly to add the documents she'd put together for him, her copies, the originals, everything she had, and stood at the table checking them. Owen came downstairs in the middle of it, rumpled, stopped on the stairs when he saw the saddlebag. You're going somewhere, he said. Just to the city, Rhett said. Back in a week, maybe less. Owen looked at him with the direct assessment of a child who has been surprised by departures before. You're coming back? I'm coming back. Owen stood on the stairs for another moment, then came the rest of the way down and went to the stove to warm himself and didn't say anything else. But Marin saw how her son stood, the set of his shoulders, the careful, casual way he held himself, the performance of being fine, and it cost her something. Rhett left. She heard the hooves go down the track, and then the valley quiet came back in, the particular silence of a cold morning with no wind. Nora came down 20 minutes later, saw the saddlebag was gone, looked at her mother. He left, Nora said, for the city. He'll be back. You believe that? Marion looked at her daughter. This girl, this careful, frightened, fiercely competent girl. Yes, she said, I believe that. Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went to start the morning work. And the ranch went on the way it always had, by the accumulated effort of people who didn't have the option of stopping. Outside the valley, the land stretched long and cold to the horizon, and somewhere on the road south, a man rode toward a city he hadn't been to in 5 years, carrying papers that could undo 5 years of wrong if the right doors opened to him, and on his back the weight of everything he owed to a woman who had built something real out of the ruins of what he'd left behind. The first 4 days after Rhett left were ordinary in the way that hard days are ordinary. The work was the same. The cold was the same. The children needed the same things they always needed. Marion kept her head down and kept moving and told herself that was enough. On the 5th day, Garrett Colton came to the ranch. He didn't send men ahead this time. He came himself, alone, which was a different kind of signal than he'd sent before. He rode up the track in the late morning, and Marion saw him from the pasture where she was checking the cattle, and she came in through the gate and met him in the yard before he had the chance to knock at the door. Mr. Colton. He tipped his hat. He looked around the yard with the assessing eye of a man who was thinking about ownership, and she recognized the look now in a way she hadn't the first time he'd come. Mrs. Holloway, I understand your hired man has left. He's on an errand, she said. He'll be back. Something in Colton's expression suggested he didn't believe her, or didn't care whether he believed her. I've come to make you a final offer, he said. Not through intermediaries this time. Between you and me, rancher to rancher, I respect what you've tried to do here. I haven't tried, she said. I've done. Fair enough? He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. She didn't take it. After a moment, he set it on the top of the fence post between them. That's a purchase offer for the full property. The price is fair. Not what it was last spring. The legal complications have affected the valuation, but fair for the current circumstances. It would clear every debt you're carrying and leave you enough to start somewhere else. I'm not starting somewhere else, Marion said. My husband is buried here. I know that. He kept his voice even. I'm not a hard man, Mrs. Holloway. I'm a practical one. The title question isn't going away. The man you had working here, Mercer, I know who he is now. I know what the legal situation is. If he intends to assert his ownership claim, you have no recourse. If he intends to sell, which men like that always eventually do, you'll get nothing. My offer protects you from both outcomes. Marion looked at him. She thought about what Rhett had said. Don't sign anything. Don't let anyone with papers through the door. She thought about the way Colton used the word practical, the way he'd been using it since the first visit, making practicality sound like a favor he was doing her. The legal situation is being resolved, she said. By whom? By the appropriate parties. Colton's jaw tightened fractionally. Mrs. Holloway, I'm trying to protect you from a process that will not go in your favor. I've been at this valley for 30 years. I know how the county court works, and I know how these title disputes resolve, and they do not resolve in favor of the person sitting on the land without clear documentation. I'm offering you a way out. I notice, Marion said, that your way out always ends with you owning my property. Silence. Leave your offer on the fence post if you want, she said. I won't be signing it. Come back with men or papers again, and I'll meet you with the shotgun instead of a conversation. Good day, Mr. Colton. She turned and walked back toward the house. Her legs were steady. She made sure of that. She heard him behind her, not moving toward her, just the restless shift of his horse. Then, You're making a mistake. I've made mistakes before, she said, without turning around. This isn't one of them. She went inside and latched the door and stood in the kitchen with her back against it and breathed. The offer was still on the fence post when she looked out the window 20 minutes later, Colton having ridden away. She went out, took it, brought it inside, and put it in the deed box without reading it. She didn't know exactly why she kept it. Something about having a record of what he'd done felt important. Tom Dalton came by that evening, which she hadn't asked for but was glad of. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee she put in front of him, and she told him about Colton's visit, not all of it, but enough. He'll go to the county board, Tom said. If he can't buy it clean, he'll use the board to force a hearing on the title before Mercer gets back with whatever he's gone to get. How fast can he do that? Faster than it should be legal to. Tom set down his cup. Whitfield at the bank. He's aligned with Colton on the board. If they can get a hearing scheduled before the title is cleared, they can put an injunction on the property. Freeze any transfers while the dispute is pending. Marin sat across from him. Which means even if Rhett comes back with the documentation, it might not matter. Not immediately. They could tie it up in court for months. He looked at her steadily. Marin, I have to ask you something. Where do you stand with Mercer? Not the legal situation. Where do you stand? She was quiet for a moment. I'm angry at him, she said. I have a right to be. You do. And I think he came back trying to do right by something he did wrong a long time ago. And I think... She stopped. I think he stayed because he found something worth staying for. That's as far as I've gotten. Tom nodded slowly. He stood between you and those men from the land company. Yes. That's not a small thing, given what his legal position is. I know it's not. Tom stood up, put his hat back on. I'll ask around quiet, see if there's talk of a hearing being scheduled. If I hear something, I'll come to you fast. He paused at the door. You've got more people in this valley behind you than you know, Marin. The Coltons of the world are loud. Doesn't mean they're the only voice. She thanked him. He rode out into the dark. She sat alone at the table and thought about injunctions and county boards and how many days Rhett had been gone and whether she'd been foolish to believe him when he said he was coming back. She thought about it for a while, and then she got up and did the dishes and went to bed, because thinking about it wouldn't change it. Rhett had been gone 8 days when the county notice arrived. It came with a rider from Heldren, an official county rider with a sealed envelope, and Marin opened it at the kitchen table with Nora standing beside her reading over her shoulder, which she didn't stop because Nora was going to know anyway. It was a notice of a title hearing scheduled for 14 days hence. The county land board, citing the unresolved ownership discrepancy in the property records, was ordering a review of all claims to the Holloway Ranch property, all parcels, to be conducted at the county seat. All parties with legal standing were required to appear. Failure to appear would be treated as a concession of claim. Nora read it twice. Then she looked at Marin. What does concession of claim mean, she said, though Marin suspected she knew. It means if we don't show up, they decide against us by default. And Mr. Mercer? He needs to be back before then. Marin folded the notice. With the right documents. What if he isn't? Marin looked at her daughter and thought about the 10 different answers she could give and chose the honest one. Then we show up anyway and we fight it as best we can. Nora looked at the folded notice in Marin's hands. I don't like this, she said. Neither do I. What can I do? Marin looked at her. 11 years old, asking what she could do. She put her hand briefly on the side of Nora's face. Keep your brother from worrying, she said. He watches you. If you're scared, he'll be scared. Nora straightened slightly, the way she did when she was given something concrete to do. All right, she said. She went back to her work. Marin sat with the notice and counted the days. Rhett came back on the 10th day, which was 4 days before the hearing. She heard the hooves on the track in the late afternoon, and she went to the window and she felt something loosen in her chest when she saw the shape of him on the horse, the familiar way he sat. She made herself stay in the kitchen instead of going out to the yard, because she needed a moment to settle herself before she looked at him directly. He knocked and came in, and he looked like the trip had cost him. He was thinner and tired in the way of someone who hadn't slept right in over a week, and there was a new cut on his right hand that had been bleeding recently. What happened to your hand? She said. Disagreement with a file cabinet in the records office. He set his saddlebag on the table. The clerk didn't want to pull the original filings. We had an argument about it. You argued with a county clerk. I was persuasive. He opened the saddlebag and took out a bundle of documents, thick, folded together, and sealed. The title transfer is filed, properly, with a witness and a county seal. There's a corresponding deed transfer naming you as the legal property holder of record, all parcels, which supersedes any prior incomplete transactions. He set the bundle on the table. There's also an attorney in Denver, a man named Colfax. He does land law. He's seen the full history of the property, and he's filed a formal response to the county board's hearing notice. He'll be there in person. Marin looked at the bundle. You hired an attorney. Yes. That costs money. It did, yes. She looked up at him. How much money do you have left? He was quiet for a beat. Enough, he said. Rhett. I have enough to get through the spring, he said. After that, we'll see. Marin sat down. She picked up the bundle and turned it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the specific substance of legal documentation that was either salvation or paper, depending on what the next 4 days produced. Cass asked about you every day, she said, without looking up. He sat down across from her. How's Owen? He didn't ask, he just... She pressed her lips together. He checked the track twice a day. Silence. The notice says all parties must appear, she said. You have to be there. I'll be there. She finally looked at him directly. He looked back. There was a great deal between them that had not been said and was not going to be said tonight, a conversation that was waiting on the other side of the hearing, and they both knew it. Get some rest, she said. You look terrible. Something moved in his face that was almost a smile. Yes, ma'am. The 4 days before the hearing had a quality of compressed time, the kind where individual hours were very long and the days somehow very short. Marin went through the documents with the methodical attention she brought to the ledger, learning them, understanding them well enough that she could speak to them if she had to. Rhett spent time in the evenings going over the legal sequence with her. How the title had originally been structured, how the incomplete transfer had happened, how the new filing resolved it. Owen knew something important was coming. He didn't ask what, which was its own form of maturity that Marin noted with the complicated pride she felt about all the ways her children were older than they should be. Cass, on the evening before they were to ride to the county seat, climbed onto the bench beside Rhett while he was cleaning his boots at the table, a small, definitive act of claiming proximity, and leaned against his arm and fell asleep there while Marin and Nora washed the dinner dishes. Marin turned from the sink and saw it. Saw Rhett sitting very still so as not to wake Cass, his face doing something complicated and quiet. Nora saw it too. She turned back to the dishes without commenting, but Marin saw her daughter's shoulders settle slightly, and she understood that Nora had made some kind of internal adjustment, something shifting in the careful architecture she'd built to protect herself from trusting too much. It was not nothing. The county seat hearing room smelled like old wood and lamp oil and the particular mustiness of official proceedings. It held about 30 people comfortably, and on the morning of the hearing it held closer to 50, because word had traveled, which meant Colton had arranged for his people to be present in numbers, and which also meant that somewhere along the transmission of information, other people had decided to come. Tom Dalton was there. The Whitmore women, Agnes and Clara. 3 families from the northern end of the valley whose names Marin knew but didn't know well. Curtis Mills, who was the closest thing the valley had to an independent voice in most disputes. People she recognized. People who had been watching her struggle for 2.5 years without intervening, who had now apparently decided that showing up was something. She sat at the respondents' table with the document bundle in front of her and Rhett to her left, and the attorney Colfax, a small, dry man in his 50s who appeared unimpressed by the room and everyone in it, on her other side. Across the room, Colton sat with 2 men who had the look of legal counsel, and with Whitfield beside him, and the alignment of those 4 men at one table had the organized quality of something that had been prepared for weeks. The board chairman was a man named Forsyth, who Marin had met once, briefly, at a valley gathering 3 years ago. He had the look of a man who wanted to get through his day without anything requiring him to make a difficult choice. She noted this and set it aside. Colton's attorneys went first. They laid out the title discrepancy clearly and technically, the incomplete transfer, the management arrangement that had lapsed, the unclear chain of ownership. It was not wrong, exactly. It was a presentation of true facts assembled in a frame that made her position look untenable. When they were done, Forsyth looked to the respondents' table. Colfax stood up. What Colfax did over the next 40 minutes was not dramatic. He was not a dramatic man. He went through the documents in sequence, established the legal history in the precise technical language of someone who had been doing this for 30 years, and built a case the way a mason builds a wall, one solid piece at a time, nothing ornamental, nothing that wasn't structural. The title transfer was complete, properly witnessed, properly filed, and properly dated prior to the county board's hearing notice. The deed transfer naming Marin Holloway as property holder of record was legally executed and filed with a county seal. The prior claim, Rhett's ownership of record, had been formally and legally relinquished and transferred. There was no outstanding dispute. The board's basis for the hearing had been resolved before the hearing began. Colton's attorney objected twice. Colfax responded to both objections with the tone of a man correcting a minor arithmetic error. Forsyth looked at the documents Colfax placed before him. He looked at Colton's table. He looked back at the documents. "The county board will take a recess to review the filings," he said. The recess was 22 minutes. When Forsyth came back in, he had the look of a man who had looked for a reason to rule differently and not found one. "The board finds that the property title to the Holloway Ranch, all parcels, is properly established in the name of Marin Holloway as of the current filing date. The petition for title review is dismissed. The scheduled auction proceedings are canceled. Any outstanding injunction requests are vacated." He looked at the room over his reading glasses, briefly, then back at his papers. "We're adjourned." It was not like the stories. No one cheered. The room just changed. A sound of movement, of people shifting, of the specific exhale of a held breath situation resolving. Colton pushed back from his table and walked out without looking at her, his attorneys behind him, Whitfield following with the compressed expression of a man absorbing a loss he'd thought was impossible. Colfax began gathering his papers with the calm efficiency of someone completing a task. Marin sat at the table and didn't move for a moment. Rhett, beside her, put his hand on the table. Not on her hand, just near it, the space between them very small. "It's done," he said quietly. She looked at the document in front of her, the one with her name on it, her name and her land and the county seal that made it as real as anything could be made. "It's done," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. She stood up and turned to find Tom Dalton immediately behind her, his hat in his hands, and then Agnes Whitmore, and then Curtis Mills, and then people whose names she was having trouble retrieving because her mind was doing something it hadn't done in a long time. It was letting go of the tightly wound readiness she'd been carrying for 2.5 years, the constant low-level preparedness for the next blow. It was letting go of it, slowly, the way you let a rope down hand over hand. It hurt, actually. That part surprised her. The releasing of it hurt in the specific way that held things do when you finally allow them to move. Tom shook her hand and then did something he hadn't done since Dale's funeral. He hugged her, briefly and awkwardly, the hug of a man who didn't do it often enough to be good at it. She patted his back and stepped away and found that her eyes were doing something embarrassing. She turned away and composed herself, and when she turned back, Rhett was standing a few feet off, talking to Colfax in a low voice, and he glanced over at her once with an expression she had no clean name for, and then looked away. The ride back to Blackstone Valley took 3 hours. She and Rhett rode mostly in silence, not the tense silence of unresolved things, but the quiet of people who had been through something and were still inside it. The land opened up around them as they climbed back into the valley, the ridgelines familiar, the particular quality of the light in the late afternoon turning everything gold at the edges. "Colfax will send his final invoice to the ranch," Rhett said at some point. "How much?" He told her. It was significant. "I can make the February bank payment and cover Colfax," she said after a moment, working it. "If the heifer sales hold." "They'll hold. The animals are in good condition." She rode on for a while. "You spent everything you had on this, most of it. That leaves you with nothing." "I've had nothing before," he said. "I know how to work from it. How to." She looked straight ahead at the road. "You could have sold the land," she said, "taken the money and gone. You had every legal right to do that." "I know." "Instead, you gave it away and spent your own money fixing the legal mess you helped create. When you say it that way, it sounds either noble or stupid." "I haven't decided which yet," she said. A beat. "That's fair." They rode on. The valley came up around them, the familiar smell of it, the pine and cold earth, and the particular dry cleanness of the air at this elevation. "I'm still angry," she said. "I want you to know that. Not at the same level, but it's still there." "I know." "You should have told me the first week." "Yes." "If you had," she said more slowly, "I would have thrown you out and fought this alone and probably lost." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that." He didn't answer that, because there wasn't a clean answer. She looked at the road ahead, at the ridge where the ranch track split off from the main valley road, at the column of smoke rising from the chimney that meant Nora had kept the fire going. that the children were home and warm and waiting. "Come in for dinner," she said. It was not an invitation that meant only dinner. They both knew that, and neither of them said so. Because some things are better approached by moving toward them than by naming them from a distance. He rode beside her up the track, and the last of the afternoon light fell across the valley, and the smoke rose straight up in the still air, and somewhere in the house a child, probably Cass, it sounded like Cass, was singing that tuneless wandering song she made when she was content, and the sound of it carried out through the walls and across the cold yard and met them as they rode in. Dinner that night was not a celebration. It was just dinner. Venison stew that Nora had kept warm on the stove, cornbread that had gone slightly dry from sitting too long, a jar of preserved peaches that Cass had been asking about for 2 weeks, and which Marin opened because it seemed like the night for it. They ate, and Marin told the children what had happened at the hearing in plain language, without drama, the way she told them most things. "So the land is ours," Owen said. "The land is ours, and nobody can take it." "It's significantly harder now," Marin said, which was the honest answer. "The legal protection is real. It's not a guarantee against everything, but it's solid." Owen looked across the table at Rhett. "You did that." "Your mother did that," Rhett said. "I helped with some paperwork." "That's not all you did," Owen said, with the blunt accuracy of a 9-year-old who had been paying attention. Nobody argued with him. Nora was eating her stew with the careful focus she used when she was processing something and didn't want it to show on her face. Cass had peach juice on her chin and was working on her second serving with the uncomplicated pleasure of a child who understood the night was good without needing to know all the reasons. After dinner, after the children were upstairs, Marin and Rhett sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee and the deed documents between them and the fire burning low. "You need to decide something," she said. He looked at her. "Whether you're staying." She kept her voice even. "Not through winter, not until the spring sails. Whether you're staying." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the wind had come up, working at the eaves the way it did on cold nights. That familiar low sound the house had carried all the years she'd lived in it. "I don't want to assume," he started. "I'm not asking you to assume anything," she said. "I'm asking you a direct question." He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I want to stay." "Then there are things we need to talk about," she said. "And they're not easy things, and we're not going to do it tonight because it's been a long day and I'm tired and you look worse than I feel." She stood and picked up the cups. "But we'll talk about them. Soon." He nodded. "The room in the barn is still yours," she said. "For now." She said "for now" in a way that carried more than 2 words usually carry. He heard it. "Good night, Marin." "Good night, Rhett." She went to bed and slept for the first time in months, without waking up at 3 in the morning with the particulars of the banknote arranged in her mind like an accusation. February came in hard, the way February always did, and the bank payment went through clean. She rode to Heldren herself to deliver it, in person, to Whitfield's desk, because she wanted to see his face when she put the certified sum in front of him. He received it with the compressed professional courtesy of a man swallowing something unpleasant, and she thanked him for his time and walked out through the bank's front door into the cold, bright February street and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, letting the air hit her face. She had made every payment on this note for 2.5 years. She had made them sick and exhausted and frightened, and she had made them alone. Nobody had handed her anything. Nobody had spotted her the difference or carried her through the hard months. She had done it on grit and calculation and the stubborn refusal to let the thing she'd built with Dale become a casualty of his absence. She stood on that boardwalk and she let herself feel that for a moment, fully, without minimizing it the way she usually did. It was not pride exactly. It was something more structural than pride. The recognition that she had been load-bearing for a long time and that the load had not broken her. Then she got back in the wagon and drove home. The conversation happened on a Sunday in late February, a gray afternoon with a thin snow coming down. The children were occupied. Nora at her books, Owen in the barn, where he'd taken to spending his free time now that there was someone out there who would talk to him about things. Cass asleep in the afternoon the way she still sometimes did, curled under the quilt on the settle. Marin went out to the barn, and Rhett looked up from the harness he was mending and saw her face and set it down. She sat on the crate across from him. She looked at her hands for a moment. "I need to say some things," she said. and I need you to let me say them without interrupting. All right. When Dale died, I decided I wasn't going to need anything from anybody. Not help, not... She stopped, restarted. I made that decision deliberately because needing things was how you got hurt. I'd watched my mother need things from my father that he couldn't give, and I'd watched what that did to her, and I decided that wasn't going to be me. She looked up at him. So I've spent 2.5 years being as self-sufficient as a human being can be, and it has kept this family alive, and it has also made me... She paused, searching for the honest word. Hard. In places I didn't mean to be hard. He said nothing. He was listening the way he listened, fully, without preparing his response while she was still talking. I'm angry that you didn't tell me, she said. I want to be clear that's still true. What you withheld from me was something I had a right to know, and the fact that it worked out doesn't change that it was wrong. She held his eyes. But I've been sitting with it long enough to know that you're also not a simple person. You came back here trying to do right by something you'd done wrong, and that's a harder thing than it sounds. Most people just stay gone. Marin, I'm not finished. He closed his mouth. I trust you with my children, she said. I've been watching you with them for months, and I trust you with them, which is not a small thing. I trust your work, and I trust your word when you give it. And I trust that when you stood between me and those men from the land company, you weren't performing anything. You meant it. She paused. What I don't know yet is whether I can trust the parts of you that are still closed, the parts you haven't shown me. That's fair, he said quietly. I'm not done. He waited. There are things in you I don't know, she said. Things from before. The years in Wyoming, whatever came before that. You carry them, and I can see the weight of them, and I am not asking you to put them on the table tonight. But I am telling you that if you stay for real, not as a hired hand, but as... She stopped. The word she was circling was difficult. As part of this, she said finally, then at some point those things have to come out. Not because I'm owed them, but because that's what it means to be part of something with other people. You have to let them see you. He was quiet for a long moment. The snow came down outside, tapping the roof softly, and somewhere in the house, Cass made a small sleeping sound. My father and I said things to each other that I couldn't take back, he said. That's the part I've never told anyone. It wasn't just that I left. It was that the last real conversation I had with him was bad. Both of us said what we actually thought, and it was worse than if we'd stayed polite. He looked at the harness in his hands, then set it down. He died, and I never... He stopped. A long pause. I never got to say I was wrong about some of it. I was wrong about some of it. Marin sat with that. I came back to settle the property because I thought it would settle the other thing too, he said. The unfinished thing. I don't know that it works that way. I don't think it does, she said. I think you carry it, and it gets lighter over time, but you carry it. Is that from experience? Dale and I had an argument the morning he died, she said, about money, about the eastern parcel, about a decision he'd made without telling me. He rode out, and I was still angry, and he didn't come back. She looked at her hands. So yes, from experience. They sat with the weight of both those things together, in the quiet barn with the snow coming down and the harness on the bench between them, and it was not a comfortable quiet, but it was an honest one, which is rarer and worth more. I don't have anything to offer you, he said. Not materially. I spent what I had. I have my labor, and I know this land, and I... He stopped. I know that's not enough on paper. I'm not looking for something on paper, she said. I have enough paper. I have a deed box full of it. She looked at him directly. I'm looking for someone who means what he says and stays when it's hard, and doesn't make my children love him, and then disappear. I won't disappear. You said you'd come back from the city and you came back. Yes. That counted, she said. More than you probably know, that counted. He looked at her with the full weight of whatever he was carrying, and she looked back without flinching, which was the most honest thing two people can do with each other. Just look, without performing anything, without managing how they appear. I'll stay, he said, as long as you'll have me. She nodded. She stood up. She didn't touch him, not then. That would come later in its own time without being rushed. But she looked at him once more at the door, and the look said what it said, and then she went back into the house. Spring arrived the way it does in high country. Not gradually, but in arguments. Warm days followed by hard frost. Crocuses coming up through snow. The land negotiating with itself about what season it was willing to become. The heifer sales in March went better than she'd projected. A buyer from 2 counties east came personally, looked at her herd and paid a fair price without the extended bargaining she'd steeled herself for. She paid off Colfax in full, paid down the balance on the Aldridge account, and put the remainder in the deed box in a separate envelope that she marked simply reserve. It was the first reserve she'd had in 2 years. She held the envelope for a moment before she put it away. It was not a large amount. It would not save her from a catastrophe, but it was the difference between nothing and something, and that difference was not small. Rhett had moved out of the barn room in March into the small room at the back of the house that had been storage since Dale died. And this had happened without announcement. He'd asked if the room was needed for anything. She'd said no, and that was the whole of the negotiation. Nora had said nothing about it. Owen had said with characteristic bluntness, "Now you don't have to walk so far in the cold," which was practical and also covered for the fact that he was pleased. Cass had immediately brought 3 of her drawings and taped them to his wall, which he had allowed without comment. The ranch in spring was different than the ranch in winter, more demanding in some ways. The calving and the planting and the fence inspections after the freeze and thaw had done its work. But the light was different, and the children were outside more, and there was a quality to the days that winter didn't have, a forward quality, a sense that things were building rather than simply enduring. Rhett and Marin worked alongside each other with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned each other's rhythms, who knew without asking who was going where and what needed doing. They argued sometimes about the north pasture rotation, about whether the old mare was worth the feed she was consuming, about a decision Marin made about the water line that Rhett thought was wrong, and said so directly. She told him he could do it his way and see how it went. It went wrong. He fixed it the right way without saying anything, and she didn't say anything either, which was its own kind of conversation. They were not smooth together. They had edges and histories and opinions about things, and the opinions did not always align. But there was something honest in the friction, something that felt more like real life than whatever the frictionless version would have been. Owen, by April, had stopped calling him Mr. Mercer. It had happened gradually, then all at once, the way those things do. One afternoon he'd said, "Rhett, the east gate is stuck again." And Rhett had said, "I'll get it," and that was that. Nobody marked it. Marin heard it from the kitchen window and didn't go out, just stood there for a moment with her hands in the dishwater. Nora took longer. Nora was going to take longer, and Marin had accepted that and wasn't pushing it. One evening in April, she came in from the barn after Rhett had helped her with a horse that had thrown a shoe, something she'd been trying to handle alone for an hour before he'd seen her struggling and come over without being asked. And she sat at the kitchen table with a look on her face that was the closest to uncertain that Nora ever looked. "He didn't take over," Nora said. "He just helped." "I know," Marin said. "There's a difference." "There is." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I still think it's possible he leaves," she said. I haven't decided not to think that." "You don't have to decide not to think it," Marin said. "It is possible. Things end. People leave. That's true." She looked at her daughter. "But possible isn't the same as likely, and likely isn't the same as certain. And you can't live at the level of the worst possible thing all the time. It'll hollow you out." Nora looked at her. "Is that what you did? For 2 years?" Marin thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "Partly." "Did it help?" "It kept me moving. I don't know if it helped." Nora absorbed that with the seriousness she brought to everything. Then she went upstairs, and the next morning she called him Rhett. For the first time, casually, in the middle of a sentence about the chickens. And if he noticed the shift, he had the good sense not to remark on it. Garrett Colton did not come back to the ranch. He remained in the valley, ran his operation, sat on the county board. He and Marin crossed paths twice in Heldren over the spring months, and both times he nodded to her and she nodded to him, and nothing was said. The defeat had not made him generous or reflective. She didn't expect it to. Men like Colton simply recalculated, found other angles, moved their attention elsewhere. His attention moved to a land dispute on the western end of the valley, involving a family with fewer resources and less legal protection. And Marin heard about it from Tom Dalton, with the specific frustration of knowing she couldn't fight everyone's battles. But she told Tom about Colfax, gave him the attorney's name and the address in Denver. Whether the family used it was their business. She'd given them the tool. Whitfield at the bank was professionally cordial at the April payment, which she delivered without ceremony and without looking for satisfaction in his face this time. She didn't need it anymore. The February payment had been enough. Tom Dalton came for dinner one evening in May, and over the table he told them that 3 families in the Northern Valley had formed an informal agreement about water rights management, a small cooperative arrangement to prevent the kind of dispute that had let Colton wedge his way into several properties over the years. He was asking if Marin and Rhett wanted to join. Rhett looked at Marin. Marin looked at Rhett. "We're in," she said. Tom nodded and cut another piece of cornbread. "Clara Whitmore asked about you," he said, to no one in particular. "She's been asking who did your legal work." "Colfax in Denver," Marin said. "I'll write down the information." "She'll appreciate that." It was an ordinary dinner conversation. Marin sat at her own table, in her own house, on her own land, and had an ordinary dinner conversation about water rights and legal resources and the affairs of neighbors, and the ordinariness of it was the whole point. The ordinariness was what she had been fighting for. In June, Marin found the wildflowers on the east field. She hadn't planted them. They'd come up on their own in the low corner near where the creek ran through, a section of ground that had been burned over the previous fall when she'd cleared some brush, and the ash had apparently been exactly what the soil needed because the field had come up in a spread of color, yellow and violet and small white clusters she didn't know the name of, that stretched from the fence line to the creek bank. She stood at the edge of it in the morning light and looked at it for a while. Dale was buried 50 yards north under the cottonwood he'd planted the year Owen was born. She went to the grave the way she sometimes did, without planning to, just finding herself there. She crouched and pulled a small weed that had come up near the stone. She sat with her arms on her knees for a moment. She had a habit of talking to him in her head sometimes, not as a mystical thing, just as a way of organizing her thoughts. She'd been doing it less over the past few months. She noticed that now. "The land is okay," she said, out loud this time quietly. "We got it sorted out." The cottonwood moved slightly in a small wind. The creek made the sound it always made. She sat for another minute, and then she stood up and brushed the dirt off her knees and walked back toward the house. Rhett was in the yard when she came around the corner, splitting the morning wood, and he looked up and saw something in her face and didn't ask about it, just nodded slightly and went back to the wood. That was the thing about him. He had a quality of knowing when to leave space and when to fill it, and while he didn't always get it right, he got it right more often than not. She went in and started the breakfast, and after a while he came in and washed his hands at the basin, and the children came down, and the morning began the way mornings did. What Marin understood by summer and could not have understood when she was in the middle of the fighting was this. Survival is not the same as living, as she had been surviving for 2.5 years. She had been good at it. She had run the ranch on rationed everything, rationed money, rationed sleep, rationed hope. And she had done it without breaking, which was genuinely hard and genuinely something. But survival at that level has a cost that you don't always notice while you're paying it. You notice it later, when the pressure drops, when the thing you were bracing against finally eases. You notice it in how rigid you became, and how far you'd retreated from the parts of yourself that had nothing to do with endurance. She had stopped laughing at things. She hadn't noticed until she started again. It started small. Cass doing something absurd with a biscuit, Rhett saying something dry about the temperament of a particular heifer, Owen's running monologue about a frog he'd found in the creek. Small things that cracked her open a little, that let something back in that she'd boarded up without realizing. She had also, she understood now, confused strength with isolation. She had believed that needing no one was the purest form of strength, that interdependence was a vulnerability, that the woman who stood alone was the woman who couldn't be knocked down. 2.5 years had proven her right about one thing. She could stand alone. She was capable of it. But capability and wisdom are not the same thing, and the wisdom, which came later and slower, was that standing alone when you don't have to is not strength. It's just loneliness with a better posture. There were people in this valley who had shown up when it mattered. Tom Dalton, who brought information and kept his own counsel about it. Agnes Whitmore, who arrived with cornbread and an argument and meant both as kindness. Curtis Mills, who came to the hearing simply because he thought it was right. These people had not fixed her problems, but they had witnessed her, which turns out to be its own important thing, to be seen struggling by someone who doesn't look away. And Rhett, who had lied by omission and then spent everything he had to make it right, imperfect in ways that were real and specific, capable of evasion, capable of being cornered by his own history, capable of sitting on a truth that was going to hurt someone because he couldn't find the right moment to say it. Human in all the ways that are inconvenient. And still, in the most consequential moment, he had stood in her yard and said no to the men who came for her land, clearly and without hesitation. And that act had cost him the thing he had every legal right to keep. You learn who people are in the moments that cost them something. Everything else is potential. By September, the ranch was running the best it had run since before Dale got sick the winter before his death. Maybe better, because Rhett understood things about the land's structure that he'd absorbed as a boy here without knowing he'd absorbed them, and that knowledge applied to the decisions they were making together changed what was possible. They expanded into the lower east pasture, which had been underutilized for 2 years. They added 12 head to the herd. A careful expansion, not aggressive. Rhett built a second water line off the northeast spring, the one Marin had always known was worth more than it looked, that gave them reliable winter water in the north pasture, without the constant monitoring the old system required. The new arrangement with the Valley Cooperative produced 2 unexpected benefits. Shared knowledge about grazing rotation that improved the quality of their winter feed, and the quiet social fact of being part of a group of ranches that looked out for each other. It was a small thing, and it was not a small thing. Colfax sent a letter in August noting that the title was fully clear, the county records updated, and that he was available should further legal needs arise. Marin wrote back thanking him and filed the letter in the deed box, which was getting full of papers that meant safety instead of papers that meant threat. She noted the change one evening when she was in the box looking for the insurance documents. She held one of the older letters, the Whitfield letter from the late payment 2 years ago, the technically polite threatening one, and then she held one of the newer ones, Colfax's clean confirmation, and she held them both for a moment, and then she put the old one in the stove. Not all of it. She kept the deed documents and the survey papers and the record of Colton's final offer, because those were the record of what had happened, and she wasn't a person who pretended things hadn't happened. But the threatening letter she burned, and she watched it go, and it was not a dramatic moment. It was just a small act of choosing what she was going to carry forward and what she wasn't. But on an evening in late September, Rhett and Owen were on the porch after dinner, Owen describing with great technical detail a system he wanted to build for catching crawdads in the creek, and Rhett was listening with the patient attention he gave Owen's plans, occasionally asking a question that redirected the engineering problems Owen hadn't fully solved yet. Nora was on the porch steps with her book, reading in the last of the light, pointedly not involved in the crawdad discussion, but not inside either. Cass was in the yard chasing the barn cat with the focused persistence of a child who had been chasing that cat unsuccessfully for months and had not adjusted her expectations. Marin stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all 4 of them. She thought about the night Rhett had knocked, that barely there knock, the sound of someone who didn't have much force left in the hand that made it. She thought about standing at the window, looking at a tall man in inadequate clothing in the cold, trying to decide whether to open the door. She thought about all the ways that one decision had cascaded outward into everything that followed. She had made that decision out of a combination of practicality and something she hadn't named at the time. She'd told herself it was just the cold, just the responsible thing to do. But she'd also known, standing at that window, that the man outside was not a threat in the way she was afraid of. She'd known it the way you know things, sometimes, through some accumulation of small signals that your body registers before your mind catches up. She had learned to trust that, the body's knowledge, over the years. It wasn't always right, but it had been right that night. She went back inside and finished the dishes and listened to the sound of her children's voices coming through the walls, Owen's fast and building, Nora's occasional dry interjection, Cass's high note of frustration as the cat evaded her again, and Rhett's voice underneath it all, steady and low. The voice of a man who had found the place where he was supposed to be and was still figuring out that he was allowed to have it. That was the last thing, and the hardest, learning that you're allowed to have the good thing. Not just the survival, not just the clear debt and the legal title and the winter preparations done right, but the actual life underneath it. The dinner table, the porch in the evening, the specific way October light falls across the valley when the season turns. The feeling, which is embarrassingly simple when you say it plainly, of not being alone. Both of them were still learning that. They were going to be learning it for a while. Neither of them was the kind of person who learned soft things quickly, and the life they were building was not without friction, not without the occasional morning where something old and painful surfaced and had to be acknowledged before they could get on with the day. But they got on with the day. That was the thing. You acknowledge the hard thing, and then you get on with the day, and eventually the days accumulate into something you could call, without embarrassment, a life. Outside, the valley was moving into its autumn colors, the aspen on the ridgeline going gold, the creek running lower and cleaner in the September dry, the cattle fat on the last of the summer grass. Blackstone Valley in fall was not a gentle place. The winter it was moving toward was real, and next year would have its own difficulties, and no document in any deed box was a guarantee against the particular ingenuity of hardship. But the ranch would be there in the morning, the children would come downstairs, the fire would start, the work would begin, and that, in the end, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing, the ordinary continuation of a life that almost wasn't, the daily practice of a family that was chosen rather than given, built out of loss and stubbornness and a winter's worth of incremental trust, standing on land that had earned its permanence through the people who refused to let it go. Some things you fight for because they're yours. Some things become yours because you fought for them. Marin Holloway had started with the first and ended with both, and in the long accounting of what a life amounts to, that was enough. That was more than enough.